Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where we will be discussing navigating MAHA, industry challenges and opportunities ahead. My name is Jennifer Caveney, and I will be facilitating today's presentation. So here is the agenda for the topics that we will be covering today. So as we all know, the MAHA report is ever evolving and complex, and our comments and observations today will be focused on ultra-processed foods and reformulation, chemical contaminants, with a few highlights on the gold standard research section. We will not be discussing the other pieces of the MAHA report, including those sections that I've noted here on this slide. This presentation and our perspectives are based on the report at this time, and as we all know, there are a lot of unknowns as everything continues to unfold. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm very happy to introduce our two speakers today. Our first speaker today is Ed Collins. Ed is the Director of Product and Process Development with the Eurofins Product Development and Innovation business in Ithaca, New York. With nearly 35 years in the food industry, including roles at Kraft and Ingredion, Ed has led product innovation at Eurofins since 2005. His expertise spans drink mixes, thermal processing, bakery startups, and spray drying, among many others. He has helped launch a wide variety of beverages, meals, snacks, and nutritional products, guiding our clients through every stage of development. Our second speaker today is Grace Bandong. Grace is the Laboratory Director for Contaminants for Eurofins Food Chemistry Testing in Madison, Wisconsin. Grace has spent over 30 years in the food and supplement industry, specializing in contaminants analysis, including elemental analysis, pesticide residue analysis, and risk assessment. Throughout her career, Grace has developed contaminant testing programs that support supplier verification for food and dietary supplement brand owners and manufacturers, and is an expert chemical risk assessment for dietary supplements and food industries. All right, Ed, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jen. We'll just kick off here on the ultra processed food side. I think you want to, thank you. So a lot of this is just what have we seen in the report. We'll talk a little bit about, obviously a new report just came out Tuesday, or a new draft came out Tuesday, so there's a lot of things in motion. Right now, you'll see that there really haven't been any changes to the FDA regulations yet. And most of the momentum and the changes that we're seeing, and obviously everybody's talking about natural colors, that's driven by the public pressure and also by state legislation, right? So you've got West Virginia, you've got California removing some dyes. You have Texas with their own Make Texas Healthy Again opportunities and putting label warnings on products, right? So how are you going to end up having to manage different labeling? What's the way to work around it? And then there's the public pressure, right? So some of it'll be what are people saying, who has influence, how are some of these things going to change over time. Jen? So in the first report, one of the things they talk about, and they're talking about it all the time, right? There's even a comment period now as we talk about what ultra processed foods are. So the definition that they provide is industrially manufactured food products made up of several ingredients, including, sugar, oil, fats, and salt, right? And then food substances of no or rare culinary use, right? And those are the things we use every day, right? Is it flavors? Is it preservatives? What types of things might we use? Emulsifiers that would come in. Typically, they're packaged and ready to consume products. So is it beverages, ramen noodles? What types of things fall in there? You've got all those high-fat products. Typically, they're refined, and we'll talk a little bit more about the micronutrients as we go through some of that. You're starting to see backlash on refined seed oils, so soybean, all the ones that we've been using for forever are now popping up here. And again, we're looking at what are these new guidelines going to be, and what's this going to mean going forward, and how will it impact what we're doing today. Jen? So some of the things that we'll consider, right? So what can you change? How do you look at what they shared, and where might that guide us for some of the things they're talking about, right? So artificial colors are an obvious one. But The other things that they stress in the report are things that a lot of us have been working on already, right? So gut health is not new, right? Probiotics everywhere, right? Whether it's bacillus, whether it's lactobacillus and the other yogurt strains, a lot of products are focusing on gut health, right? So we have all the prebiotic fibers. There's the move to make sure they all have a physiological effect, right? How are they defined? There's probably a little more emphasis on the micronutrient losses as we look at refined grains and how products are taken apart, right? So what are ways that we might be able to replace that? Sugars come up again, right? How do we reduce sugar? For years, cereal manufacturers, they were 13 and then 12 and 10, and how low can they take that, incrementally as they try to, reduce the sugars but maintain, consumer liking for a lot of the products. And then artificial colors we'll talk a little bit about, and protein. Protein was listed as, Americans need more protein. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. Jen? So fiber and micronutrients, right? What are the ways that we can get around it? Is it just whole grains? Are there other ways to add these? And a lot of these are formulation things that you see going on today, right? And the concern is, what is this UPF focus going to do to products, and what does it mean you have to put on it, right? So everybody went after project verified non-GMO for a while. Is there going to be a flag? Is there going to be something that we'll have to look at? So obviously beans, peas, all the new plant protein substances, but more in an unrefined manner, right? So I think as you look at what they're implying, are things that are, say, isolates, are they going to become defined as an ultra processed ingredient? So how do you break those down so that you don't lose, or how do you get those ingredients so that you don't lose all the other things you don't know about today that are important for health? There's things like chia seeds and flax seeds, right? High in fiber, high in omega-3s. Those are things that already fit really well in this how do we eat healthier category, right? You can buy them straight. The refined fibers is going to be something that is interesting, right? So you have, say, inulin, which you can do at very high concentrations, but maybe it's not acid stable, right? Or you have beta glucan that does a lot of viscosity if you get too high, but it has a lot of other, benefits like soluble corn fiber as well, right? So how do all those taste? How can you use some of them for sweetness addition, right? So, inulin, obviously, depending on the DE or the chain length of the different oligosaccharides, right, will provide different levels of sweetness. So like as you're looking to reduce sugar and you want to increase fiber, are there things you can do with those types of ingredients to improve both the sweetness profile, the nutritional profile in terms of fiber, and then finally, how do you reduce the sugar and improve the mouthfeel, for example? One of the things that comes out of that, and this is again something that Eurofins does every day, is what is the appropriate fiber testing? So there's McCleary, there's Lee. Some measure these better than others. So as you go down your journey of how do I make my product healthier, or how do I add more fiber, it's also important to understand that there are some testing restrictions, or one test method being better to measure different attributes than some. Jim? Sugar reduction, right? So, I mean, Jen mentioned I've been in the industry for 35 years. Early on, I worked on crystalline fructose as part of, Kool-Aid, for example. And there's always been talk about high fructose corn syrup and cane sugar. It's popped back up, right? It's just popular conception, right? Sugar does a lot of things. There's texture in baked goods, right? So it's not just the sweetness, it's the structure. It's how does the cookie crumble? Is it a hard snap cookie? What type of cookie is it? And then you get into like, well, if we're going to reduce it, how can I reduce it, right? So high intensity sweeteners. We're going to talk a lot about grass, right? Everybody knows there's conversations, there's bills about removing, changing how we do grass. A lot of the high intensity sweeteners, stevia, monk fruit, as well as a bunch of the polyols, right, the sugar alcohols, all came in through self-affirmed grass, right? And so you still, with the high intensity ones, you have to look at how are you going to replace how are you going to improve the structure of the product, right? Because you're taking out so much mass. How are you going to handle the aftertaste? I'm sensitive to the stevia, so I picked that one up. Other people are sensitive to other things, right? Then you start looking at sugar alcohols. Well, you might say erythritol, it has good sweetness. I'm going to use it at a similar level as sugar. Well, erythritol likes to crystallize. It doesn't have the same solubility. So you need to look at what are the other things that you might use to balance out that sweetness profile, some of the structure that it gives you, as well as, like, is it soluble? Does it get grainy? What things does it change in the product? I talked a little bit about the higher DE prebiotic fibers and how they can be used to improve texture. That works on some of the baked goods as well. And then alternate ingredients. So date paste is growing. You're seeing a lot of these things. They're also good for, say, water activity control and helping you maintain moisture or structure in some of the products as well. This is probably the big one, right? So here in one of our storage rooms, we have just a series of studies for different clients looking at how are we going to change our color system without it fading, right? So a lot of the natural colors, they're less resistant to light. They'll break down over time. How do you measure that accelerated? How do you match the color, right? So, can you do it with one color? Do you need two colors? It's not as simple as that. Do you need to change your packaging style, right? So, like, are there ways to minimize the UV penetration? So, is it your label is a UV barrier? Is it the packaging material? Do you just make it so it's not exposed to light? How do you get it to maintain color over time, right? And then are there things that you can add, like say it's oxidative or something's browning, and it's related to the polyphenols and the color, for example? Are there things you can do to slow down those reactions to try to improve the stability? So there's a lot of little things that you'll need to look at. The other difference is it tastes different, right? So you'll get the flavors of those polyphenols. We all know that they, or whatever other compounds are in there, that it will impact it. It's more sensitive to temperature and pH changes. They're going to be more expensive, right? It's just you're not going to be able to replace one for one, dollar for dollar, an artificial color and a natural color. And as I mentioned, how are you going to be able to match that really well, right? Like, how important is that color to the product? Is it a significant identifier, right? So there was talk about, like, what will Skittles look like, right? That was something in there. And there's also a consideration about what's this supply going to look like. I'm sure they're planning crops ahead, knowing that this is coming. So we'll see how the supply chain works. Jen? Thank you. We'll pass it to Grace and be back shortly.
Hi, thanks, Ed. And following from Ed's comments about all the things that we're trying to consider and all this stuff, we're going to take you to contaminants and how this all come into play. And from here, from the report, we see that this is just a summary of telling us that there's chemicals out there. There's tens and thousands of these different chemicals that could possibly make it into our bodies, into our systems. And most of them are, come through the exposure that we have is through our food and water and just in general the air we breathe. And this they've grouped this chemical compounds into the categories of how different categories, like the pesticides, the persistent organic pollutants, although pesticides, some of them are also persistent organic pollutants, and our air pollutants, and of course heavy metals has always been a concern for everybody. They come from our legacy paint that we've used, they're in our pipes, and they're just in our soil, and they're left over from some of the pesticides that we've used in the past. And the persistent organic pollutants that we have, they get introduced to us in our food, and some of them are being used in the production of our foods, in manufacturing, and sometimes just because where we have our produce, our fruits and vegetables, where they're grown, there could be in proximity to the manufacturing plant or the refinery somewhere, and they all coexist in the environment around us. And knowing, with the awareness that we're surrounded by all this, how do we approach contaminants? Jen, next slide. And so we always go back to understanding our risk. And when we have the level of risk that we have, we always think about it as a combination of the materials and ingredients that we have and where we're sourcing them and our best practices. How do we manufacture our food? How do we source them? How do we grow them? And that's where you usually start for assessing chemical risk, meaning assessing focusing on the food, the direct ingestion that we expose ourselves to, even for the cosmetics that we have, and is we try to consider the factors that will result in these chemicals making it all the way to the food that we eat, to the food that we consume on a daily basis, and even through to water. And so in general, we put together the sourcing them from ingredients and from our suppliers and from the way we make them. And risk, when we consider risk, one of the highest risks, next slide, Jen, is for our infant children and the younger population. And on the other half of that too is the immunocompromised that we have. And this is also from the report, the slide that shows us all the health risks and the child development stages that this chemical contaminants can affect us in our growing, and how they get introduced into the diets or into exposure for our infants and for our children. And the different chemicals that are usually been a focus for years and years now. Heavy metals have always been at the top because of through the years, experience, decades, we've seen issues with lead and arsenic, especially inorganic arsenic, in the diet of our children. And then we have in the PFAS, BPA, and pesticides, the persistent organic pollutants that we have, they end up in the way for packaging. So they come in contact with our food when we package them and present them to consumers. And then pesticides, we've used them for years and years, and some of them do persist in the environment. And a lot of them, one particular class that everybody's very concerned about, the effect that they have in the development of the children is the endocrine disruptors. And these chemicals are everywhere. Fungicides, herbicides, which are, you know, under the general class of pesticides, triazoles, and a lot of the pesticides fall into the category of endocrine disruptors. Next slide. And all throughout this, the concern that we have for contaminants is in our food is basically by law the introduction of adulterated food. That the biggest concern is that the U.S. code tells us that we cannot introduce adulterated food into present them to consumers. And the definition of adulterated food, according to the code, is food is adulterated if it contains contaminants and unsafe substances that could be poisonous or harmful to the body. And examples of this are pesticides, food additives, color additives, some animal drugs, and the other section is the misrepresentation and ingredient issues. For example, you tell them that it contains apple juice and it really has something else besides apple juice in there. And also the misrepresentation and ingredient issues. Either a valuable ingredient is missing or it's been replaced by something that's kind of a substitute for it. And some of this, some of the adulteration, although this is for food, it also goes into some of the non-prescription drugs or dietary supplements that's out there. So it's supposed to be a natural ingredient, but then they get kind of replaced with drugs, so to increase the efficacy of the product. And so basically all of this fall into the category when we're thinking of chemical contaminants in our food. We are looking at making sure that we're not providing consumers with adulterated food. And next slide. And this has been a concern, and why it's been a concern is because it's there, it's happening in the real world. We do find them in our products, and that's why there's been a lot of warning letters due to misbranding. There's been an increase in 483s, and that has to do with some products not having proper specifications and not looking at contaminants in their products, and also sometimes not knowing that they had inadvertently introduced contaminants into their products. And the other sources of it is when we import products into the to the U.S., we introduce some of these contaminants from outside. And part of the reason is because there are different regulations across the globe, and as trade becomes global, when they cross borders, sometimes those regulations don't quite really agree. So that's where one of the issues where we've been seeing is there's the import alerts because of the presence of contaminants, chemical contaminants in products that are coming into the country. Examples of this are import alerts for pesticides, and they usually get detained and not allowed to enter the country until they have been tested or proven that they do not contain the suspect compound that we thought they had. For example, just in 2025, 2 of them, like spinach coming in, was suspected of having permethrin in it, and tomatoes having carbendazim in it. And then, as always, there's heavy metals, and we see them from grape juice, plums, and sometimes even in dietary supplements that come in manufactured outside of the U.S. They come into the U.S. and they've had issues with lead and mercury. And recently, I'm sure many of you have heard for our apple juice recalls due to the containing inorganic arsenic. Next slide. So what's been done, because these chemical contaminants, they're around, they persist, and with the continuing practices that we do, we will still, they're still a concern. And the focus for one of the trends that we've seen is that increased testing and data-driven, and also the drive for lower detection limits. And as one example of that is the concern for heavy metals for infant, baby food, and toddler diets, and FDA's initiative for closer to zero. We keep looking at the impact of these chemicals on our bodies and in our health and our systems, and we evaluate them, and we do stock studies, and then we come up. One of the goals for the closer to zero is to come up with action levels for these heavy metals. Action levels for lead has already been finalized, and what this does is forces, because it's data driven and increased testing, the way to mitigate risk is increased testing and the drive for lower detection limits. And what that also means for us is the search and the drive for looking for better methods and for using better technology out there, as we keep wanting to go lower and lower in detecting all this chemical contaminants that we have, because the goal is really as close as possible to zero, to not having them introduced into our diets. And one of the biggest concern is heavy metals, especially for infant formula, for toddlers, for baby food. Next slide. And how we do that, one of the things is as we screen, it's like I said, there's like thousands of pesticides out, chemical contaminants out there. For pesticides alone, there are about over 6,000, even probably higher now, more than 6,000 registered pesticides allowed in our raw agricultural commodities. And how do we possibly screen them? So one of the advancements that we've seen, and the trend that we've seen these days, is the doing what we call non-targeted analysis and this suspect screening workflow that starts where what this does, it allows you to do testing, broad testing, where it allows you to just have comprehensive exposure detection. And then because you're able to test a lot of chemicals at the same time, so methods, the non-targeted analysis provides us with methods, and of course it's related to software and instrumentation that, and also uses part of it. There's AI help in the reduction of data, in the and the interpretation of data, allows us to look at, instead of 1 to 10 or 1 to 25 chemical contaminants at one time, it allows you to look at a broad hundreds or maybe sometimes into the thousands of chemicals at the same time. And then, or when you want to do a suspect screening workflow, you can narrow them and base your screening on a database. Like, for example, you just want to do a whole broad screen for pesticides. So you can put that database in there and use that target. And once you get a profile of something that you've seen, then you can couple it with our what we currently are doing, targeted analysis, so we can target those compounds that are of potential interest, and that compounds that we've determined that are of higher risk. But this is one thing that right now that's trending, I would say, and in the advancement, is that ability to test for a broad number of chemical contaminants in one run. And it allows us to get a way broader pictures of the exposure that we have. And with that, I'll pass you on to gold standard for research to Ed.
Thanks, Grace. Right, so on this piece, right, if you've read through the report, there's actually 10 different sections where they talk about improving gold standard research. We'll talk a little bit about what that is. Probably the ones that impact us or that we've been talking most about lately is what's the GRAS oversight? How's that going to change? What things do we see on nutrition trials, right? And what will we learn there? And Grace mentioned a little bit on number 4, right? How are we going to use different methods, or you know, is machine learning, AI? What are we going to do to go through the mountains of data that may exist, right? And then the post-marketing surveillance. There's always like, all right, here's what we said it would do, right? That kind of is being brought in the some of the GRAS conversations, Jim. So in the report that came out on Tuesday, right? So there's a new draft report. They gave us a little more information on what their expectations are, right? What will the government look for, right? So in this case, the National Institute of Health, you know, they want to strengthen the mechanisms, right? The main things they're focusing on, and there's actually a couple of bullets on some of these points in there, is the replication and the reproducibility, right? So like, did it just happen once? Did it happen twice? How many times did we look at it, right? Did we get the same answer? And also who funded it, right? So there's a lot of the background, like the person that funds it usually gets the results they expect, right? And how does that flow forward, right? And then, you know, how can they make sure that they identify the evidence gaps? And it'll be interesting to see what the scholars program looks like. Is it a panel of experts, or how do they build it to really look at how well we're peer reviewing the things that are going out, right? Or are things that don't meet muster getting through, or how's everything getting to a journal, and when does it become, you know, kind of the standard? So it'll be interesting to see how this evolves. Okay. So there've been a couple of bills that have come out really just recently, or proposals, right? There's the Food Chemical Reassessment Act, and there's the Ensuring Safe and Toxic Free Foods Act. They're pretty similar, right? There are things that are uniform, but between them, if you go to the next slide. And it's also one of RFK Jr.'s favorite topics, right? Like, he's talked a lot about the GRAS loophole, right? If you go to the MAHA webpage, he's got a video, right? And he talks about how we close the self-affirmed GRAS loophole, right? In this legislation, they're talking about, well, what's the post-market assessment? How often are we going to look at it? How many things do we want to look at, and how do we start digging through it, right? So, you know, both bills kind of talk about, all right, we're going to reassess 10 ingredients every 3 years, right? One of them calls out 10, I think it's 10, that looks like more than 10, but calls out that series of ingredients that they should look at today, right? We know the artificial colors, right? States have already started passing laws against a lot of those. A bunch of us are reformulating against those targets already. You know, there are allowances for comment periods. How's that going to work? And then you know, in this drive for transparency, the FDA then has to publish what the basis for that decision is on the website so that people can see it. Now, if you go one step further and you watch the video on self-affirmed GRAS and the loophole, it points out that there's 400 food ingredients in Europe. There's 10,000 in the US. And the question posed was, well, why do we have 9,600 more? And conversely, you know, why do we have more chronic disease? And that's what they're talking about. And the question becomes like, well, what are they going to, what's going to happen? What are people going to propose? And then what are they going to go backwards and look at, right? Go to the, you know, there's sorry, yeah, one more comment on this. A lot of the things we use today are self-affirmed, right? So stevia, erythritol, you know, I mentioned earlier, are all these things that's going to pass muster long term as we start going through some of these, you know, post-market reviews or safety reviews or improving the standards of research, right? You can't just say like, it's a water-based extraction, it's the same, it's not any different than food when we're using it at different concentrations. So it'll be interesting to see what logic or reasoning they use the, you know, that the FDA begins to use to say like, all right, we should reevaluate these, or we should reevaluate those, and how do they get to that data? So there's a lot of interesting things that'll come out of both of these bills, and the way that the FDA is already talking about how they'll look at, you know, self-affirmed GRAS and how they might change it. Go ahead to the next one. The second one is nutrition trials, right? So there's a long conversation, and Grace touched on it, right? She had the slide up about like contaminants in food that you know, an expectant mother is eating, or contaminants in breast milk, or contaminants, you know, where are all the contaminants coming from? How do those things play a part, as well as what are we doing with some of the ingredients that we're using, right? So, you know, there's, when you look at like childhood chronic disease, what are they going to change? How are they going to do that study, right? There's a lot of things out there that they want to look at. There's the healthy eating index. There's the focus on ultra processed foods, right? So there's already SNAP exclusions, right? States have applied to exclude certain things from their SNAP reimbursement, right? You can't buy soda anymore, junk foods out there in a couple of states, I think. So there's a lot of things going. And then how do they monitor that data, right? You know, are they going to use that to inform a study? Are they going to be able to tie that back to health outcomes? So it'll be interesting to see how they use some of those tools. And then if you're using artificial intelligence, for example, to comb through this data or to write the report, you know, and come up with the answer, there's always the question of, you know, is the randomization good? Obviously, with the definition of gold standard, you know, they're talking about, is the randomization appropriate, right? I don't know enough about AI, like how do you check the randomization of the study, or what are the best ways to go through those mountains of data? You know, how do you get to that final conclusion? And then throughout the report, there's talk about, well, who's funding the research? Do they get the answer that they want? Is it the right answer? And how does that, you know, here we're calling it political influence, but it's really the people that are paying for it, or, you know, looking for an outcome. Is the study designed to make sure they get that outcome, and is that the right design? So as they get into these nutrition trials and start talking about doing these large randomized trials, it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out. And then they take that one step further, because there's also talk about what are the new dietary guidelines for Americans, right? How are they going to change? When are they going to come out? So a lot of things going on all at once. Next slide. And this is, you know, some of these things we've already seen start happening, right? And you know, there's no crystal ball really, but it's like, what's everybody talking about? You know, how often are they talking about it? Do they keep mentioning it, right? You know, natural colors, obviously there's, and this like every other slide, it's out of date as of Tuesday, right? You know, if we wrote it last week, it's already out of date. Like, how quickly are things moving through the states? Right, we mentioned everything going on. What's the industry scrutiny, right? So if you watch the self-affirmed grass video on the MAHA website, you'll get a little bit of that feel for what they may be thinking. The environmental and chemical contaminants. Grace talked about the drive for zero, right? There's stories, not even stories, but there are reports and studies, say, where they've been using sludge, right? For fertilizer, and the PFAS has contaminated the land. So like, what's going to be the outcome of that? How are we going to do it? And there's a whole lot of smaller things that they have in the reports that talk about that. Obviously, independent testing and research are key to making sure those are good. And then how do all those things change SNAP, right? So are there things that are allowable today that you can purchase with SNAP that will no longer, excuse me, that will no longer be part of the program, right? So are you, does your product now fall out of compliance, with the school lunch program? How will that all change? Next one. And when you hear it, right, we're looking at a new definition of ultra processed foods. Is it going to be on the front of the pack? What are they going to do? What is the FDA going to do with that definition once they have it, right? And so it's never too early to think or develop a strategy about what you might want to do, right? It could be, all right, we're going to look at going to whole grain, right? Or we're going to look at, natural colors is down the road, but like, what are the things that we can change just based on that impact, right? There's this belief that, RFK is probably 10 years older than I am, about how great our food system was back in 1967. So where are we going back to? What do we want to do? And then how, like, generically, do we just make our products healthier to maybe get ahead of that UPF ranking system, right? Or whatever may come out of it. None of these things are obviously written in stone, but there's a lot of conversation about how we're going to define it. And then you just got to ask, well, once we define it, what are we going to do with it? The EPA and FDA are also going to look at what are the chemical safety standards, right? Grace mentioned we want to get to zero. How low, how little can we detect, right? What's our limit of quantification? Where do we need to get to, right? You've got that whole chain of contamination from breast milk to infant, all different contaminations, but you've got a whole chain of contamination that you want to look at, and how does that impact kids, right? What are the things that are going to come out of it? Is it a PFAS free, like less than 1 part per trillion? What's the number going to be? Where are they going to go with it? How's it going to impact our products, right? So these are things that obviously we won't get to tomorrow, but as they look at these things and where they're going and what they talk about, I think more is going to come out of that, right? It's not just going to say like, well, here's the next report. They're moving pretty quickly. I mean, they're trying to get stuff done, it feels like, right? So we'll see where it goes, right? What other products are going to be banned in SNAP or WIC or any of the other programs? They're even talking about how the Department of Defense needs to change their menus, right, to be more in compliance with some of these ideas. And then it's just, what type of research do you need, right? So like, what do you have to do to, where does your product fall potentially in some of these categories? What are the things you need to think about? How much planning, or how far do you want to get ahead, or at least be prepared for some of these changes? It is exploring, different sweeteners. Is it exploring different types of fiber, whole grain? There's a myriad of things you can look at, and really just, how does your product fit into this, you know, into kind of the ultra processed framework, where can you make it healthier? I mean, that's going to be the request that comes out of it, and we'll see how, you know, all of these recommendations get pulled together in the end, right? And what they may change in labeling to impact all of us. And I think that kind of sums up what we have to talk about today. I mean, we could talk about this forever, right? There's a lot of things we've been working on. There's a lot more things we can do. But you know, it's moving, and some of the things they mentioned in the first report, or they talk about in public, or have already moved ahead. And what are the things that they're talking about every day that, you know, people are going to start asking for exceptions or exclusions or pass new laws? It'll be it's an exciting time to be a food scientist, I guess. So thank you. Jen, are we going to open for questions or?
Yes, so we do have some questions in the chat. All right, so our first one, Ed, I think this would be a great question for you. What is the first step to evaluate if reformulation is necessary for my product?
Yeah, I think the only one that really jumps out would be natural colors, right? I mean, Europe banned many of the dyes previously, right? They've been tied to hyperactivity in kids. So I think that's the one everybody knows about. The other things, like I'd have to look and see how the warning labels in Texas and some of the other places look, but that might be something interesting for people to look at to see how they potentially fall against those, and whether they want to make some changes proactively in that area. Excuse me.
Thank you. Our second question, Grace, I think this would be a great question for you. If I am concerned about contaminant screening in my supply chain, where should I start? I think you're on mute, Grace.
Sorry. One of the first steps definitely is to do your risk assessment, a chemical risk assessment, and get to know your product, where all the processes it's gone through, from the very raw ingredients that look at each of your ingredients that all make up the product, and do a chemical risk assessment, so you can assess your risk for the having the presence of chemical contaminants in your final product.
Perfect, thank you. All right, another question. So Ed, previously, you know, we were discussing kind of the high fructose corn syrup debate. So are there safety concerns in that scenario, removing high fructose corn syrup and then replacing it with more of a pure cane sugar?
So that I mentioned where, like, there's the public opinion, right? So President Trump said, like, we need Mexican Coke, right, with pure cane sugar. There shouldn't be any kind of food safety risk at that, right? You know, you've got, and you obviously have to evaluate your own, but there's no, you know, when your pH is down there and you're processing it the way they do, there's no reason that you couldn't make the product just as safe. So from that perspective, no. But you know, there's always the debate of, you know, what tastes better, and you know, there's been a debate going back into the, you know, 80s and 90s when we were, you know, when crystalline fructose and HFCS were moving about, you know, are they different just because it's, you know, a couple of different sugar molecules than what you're used to, right? So no real safety risk.
Perfect, thank you, thank you. All right, well, you know, just want to say thank you so much to Ed and Grace for today's presentation, and just want to extend a big thank you to everyone who attended. You know, definitely reach out to us with any questions, and we would be happy to connect further to discuss this very important topic. We will continue to be monitoring updates on MAHA and how it is impacting the food and supplement industries. So definitely stay connected with us as we all navigate this together. This now concludes today's presentation. I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.